So I want you to imagine just for a second that you are locked in an interrogation room.
Never a fun place to be.
Right, exactly. And you are facing years in prison for, of all things, just forwarding a social media post.
Wow.
Yeah. Your career is basically over, your freedom is completely gone, and the people sitting across that table from you, well, they hold your entire future in their hands.
And I mean, the normal human reaction there is just sheer panic.
Oh, absolutely. You'd ask for a lawyer, or you'd beg for mercy, or maybe you just completely shut down. But in this scenario, to save yourself, you don't do any of those things.
Okay, so what do you do?
Instead, you sit up straight, you look your interrogators dead in the eye, and you start lecturing them about quantum physics.
That is, wait, really?
Yeah. Quantum physics, complex computer science algorithms, advanced mathematics. You basically build your entire legal defense out of highly abstract academic theory.
That is wild.
Right. Well, welcome to a brand new deep dive. Today, we are unpacking a truly bizarre, just fascinating psychological phenomenon.
It really is a remarkable cognitive landscape to explore, because today we're analyzing a stack of sources from the Chattel-Selms documentation.
Right.
And these documents compile some really in-depth, cross-disciplinary psychological analyses of a very specific legal event, which is the case of Dr. Jingyuan Chen.
Now, before we really get into the weeds here, I do want to lay some groundwork and just be crystal clear with you right up front.
Yeah, that's important.
The sources we are looking at today, they contain evaluations of a highly politically charged legal case.
Very charged.
Dr. Chen faced charges of, quote, picking quarrels and provoking trouble. And this was all related to him forwarding some overseas social media content.
Yeah.
But we are taking absolutely no sides here.
None at all.
Our goal today is strictly and, impartially to report on the psychological frameworks and the cognitive theories that are actually presented in this source material.
Exactly. We are acting purely as guides to the original text. We're just dissecting the science of how human minds operate under these really specific, intense conditions.
Yeah, the focus is entirely on the mechanics of the mind.
Yeah.
We're not here to litigate the case.
Right, because what we actually have in these documents is this sort of real-time record of a profound psychological collision.
A collision. I like that word for this.
Yeah, I mean, you're looking at this highly complex, skeptical individual on one side, and then on the other side, you have this incredibly rigid, high-pressure institutional system.
Okay, so let's start by getting inside the mind of the defendant, Dr. Chen. Because the man is isolated, he is cut off from his normal life, facing severe legal consequences.
Which is objectively terrifying.
Totally. For most of us, that level of stress would just completely fracture our ability to think clearly.
Oh, for sure.
But instead, he writes what the sources call a blood letter of defense from prison. And it is definitely not your standard plea for leniency.
No, it is not.
The psychological analyses in our sources point out that he's exhibiting what is called cognitive complexity and something called post-formal thinking. So for those of us who haven't taken a psychology seminar recently, what does that actually look like in practice?
Well, so post-formal thinking is basically considered the highest stage of adult cognitive development.
Okay.
In earlier stages of development, human beings tend to think very much in black and white.
Like true or false, good or evil.
Exactly. A causes B. But post-formal thinking is this ability to tolerate extreme ambiguity. It's the capacity to hold totally contradictory ideas in your mind at the exact same time and just understand that reality is made up of these overlapping, deeply complex systems.
So it's comfort with the gray area.
Right. And when Dr. Chen is placed under this immense crushing pressure, rather than regressing to a simpler state of panic like most people would, his mind actually accelerates into this highly complex mode.
And the way he applies this is just staggering to read. I mean, he doesn't just say, hey, I didn't mean to cause trouble.
No.
He attempts to literally dismantle the legal charges using complex systems theory.
It's incredible.
He cites Gödel's incompleteness theorem from mathematics. He brings in the CAP theorem from computer science and this physics concept of self-organized criticality, or SOC.
Yeah, the SOC model is key here.
The documents show he is literally using cross-disciplinary academic frameworks to argue his innocence to a room full of police officers.
Which is, you really have to look closely at the mechanism of why he's using these specific theories. Because the system is accusing him of causing social instability just by forwarding a post, right? They are using what psychologists call intuitive causality. It's this really simple idea that if you push a domino, it falls.
You pushed it, so it's your fault.
Exactly. You forwarded a post, therefore you caused the disruption. But Dr. Chen uses the physics concept of self-organized criticality, the SOC model you mentioned, to argue against this.
Okay, wait, that's the sandpile model, right?
It is, yeah. So imagine you slowly drop grains of sand, just one by one. Eventually, they form a pile. And at a certain point, that pile reaches a critical state. So then one single tiny grain of sand is dropped, and the entire pile collapses in a huge avalanche.
Okay, I can picture that.
Well, the system is blaming Dr. Chen for being that one grain of sand. They're basically saying, hey, your grain caused the avalanche.
But his argument is that blaming the single grain of sand just demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of actual physics.
Exactly.
Because the avalanche was really caused by the structural instability of the entire pile, which had been, building up for a long time. Literally any grain of sand would have caused it at that point.
Right, so he is arguing for structural causality over their intuitive causality?
Wow. And then he takes it even further using the CAP theorem from computer science, which is just wild.
Yeah, that part is fascinating. So in distributed computer networks, the CAP theorem states you can only ever guarantee two of three things.
Okay, which are?
Consistency, availability, or partition tolerance. And the internet itself is this massive partition network. Information fragments and distorts completely naturally as it moves around.
Right, like a game of telephone.
Exactly. So he is trying to explain to them that holding one node, meaning himself, responsible for the consistent state of the entire network is, well, technically illiterate.
That is...
Oh, yeah.
I mean, he is deconstructing legal charges using network architecture.
He really is.
But, okay, I'm reading this and I'm thinking, sure, this is a brilliant academic paper. But as a legal defense, it just feels completely detached from the reality of his situation.
You think so?
Well, yeah. I mean, I struggle to see how a highly educated person thinks a stressed-out detective is going to sit back and say, yes, the CAP theorem, you're free to go, sir.
That's a very fair point.
It makes me wonder if we are maybe mislabeling this. Like, is this actually psychological resilience we're looking at, or is it just a massive defense mechanism?
How do you mean?
Is it possible he is just over-intellectualizing his situation so he can avoid the terrifying, visceral reality that he is currently locked in a cage? Like he's building a fortress out of math so he doesn't have to actually feel the fear.
So the psychological frameworks in the text address that exact friction. And you're spot on. The sources do identify his behavior as a defense mechanism.
Okay, so he's defending himself mentally.
Yes, specifically through what they call intellectualization and sublimation.
Sublimation, right.
But here is the key difference. In psychoanalytic theory, those are categorized as highly mature defense mechanisms.
Oh, really? As opposed to what?
Well, when someone faces severe trauma, lower-level defense mechanisms would include things like denial, where you just pretend it isn't happening at all, or projection, where you lash out at people.
But he isn't denying he's in prison. He's like hyper-analyzing the prison.
Exactly. Rather than succumbing to those pathological lower-level defenses, he channels his severe anxiety into a really high-value cognitive output. He turns his own suffering into an object of theoretical reflection, and the sources actually connect this mechanism directly to Viktor Frankl's logotherapy.
Right, Frankl. He was the psychiatrist who survived the Holocaust.
He was. And Frankl observed that human beings can endure almost any level of suffering as long as they can attach some kind of meaning to it. Humans are driven by this profound will to meaning.
So if you can find meaning in the pain, it stops being just pointless pain and becomes, I don't know, a project or a purpose.
Yes, Dr. Chen is engaging in this profound meaning-making. He isn't just trying to get out of a charge anymore. He is actively turning his ordeal into a historical and academic document.
That's powerful.
And by doing that, he is preserving his self-congruence.
Self-congruence.
It means maintaining an internal consistency of your own values. If he had just broken down and confessed to something he didn't actually believe, his self-congruence would shatter.
Which would cause real trauma.
Deep psychological trauma. But by defending himself this way, he achieves post-traumatic growth. He basically refuses to let the system define him as a criminal and insists on defining himself as a scholar. The math and the physics, they're just the tools he uses to keep his identity intact.
Okay, but the tragedy of this, though, is that a fortress of complexity doesn't do you much good if the people besieging it only speak the language of absolute simplicity.
That is the real tragedy here, yes.
So let's pivot to the exact opposite environment. Because to really grasp the whole picture from these sources, we have to understand the mind of the system that was judging him.
We do.
We need to look at exactly why this brilliant, complex defense just completely failed to resonate.
So the sources paint a very specific psychological picture of the police, the prosecutors, and the judges involved here. The analysis shifts from individual psychology to this idea of a defensive collective psyche.
Defensive collective psyche, so it's about the institution itself.
Exactly. Judicial officers operate in an incredibly high-stress, low-ambiguity, high-accountability environment.
Yeah, they've got quotas, they've got bosses.
Right. And when the human brain is placed in that kind of bureaucratic pressure cooker, its cognitive processing fundamentally alters.
Because the brain is basically just an energy conservation machine, right?
Pretty much.
When we are under stress, it stops using the slow, analytical parts of the mind just to save power.
Daniel Kahneman's framework of System 1 and System 2 thinking maps onto this perfectly.
Oh, right.
System 2 is that slow, deliberate, analytical thought process, which is what Dr. Chen is using.
But System 2 takes a massive amount of cognitive resources.
Exactly. It's exhausting.
Sure.
And the institutional workers, who are under all this intense pressure from their superiors and the heavy burden of their caseloads, well, they are forced into System 1 thinking.
Which is the fast, automatic stuff.
Right. They rely heavily on heuristic processing.
Mental shortcuts.
Exactly. They rely on quick rules of thumb and binary thinking. True or false, right or wrong, guilty or innocent.
Yeah, I mean, there is zero room for a nuanced academic debate about self-organized criticality when you have a quota to meet and a boss breathing down your neck.
And the mechanism of heuristic processing in this specific environment, it manifests as what the sources call threat perception bias.
That perception bias.
Yeah. In a high-anxiety organization, the system becomes completely hypersensitive to anomalies. Any complexity, any skepticism, basically any behavior that doesn't fit neatly into a pre-existing box is immediately coded as a threat to order.
Okay, let's try to ground that mechanism for a second.
Yeah.
It honestly reminds me of an overly aggressive email spam filter.
Oh, that's a great comparison.
Right. Like a spam filter doesn't actually read your email to understand the nuance or the context of your conversation.
No, it doesn't have the time or capacity.
It just scans for specific heuristic triggers, words like urgent or money, or maybe just a weird link. And the moment it hits one of those triggers, boom, it dumps the email into the junk folder to protect the server from a potential virus. It doesn't care if it accidentally throws out a legitimate, important message from your boss. It just optimizes for safety through extreme simplification.
That is spot on. The institutional system described in these sources operates exactly like that spam filter. It demands a simplified input so it can process it safely and quickly.
And Dr. Chen is anything but a simple input.
Exactly. When the system encounters him, his complexity triggers all their heuristic alarms. And this craving for systemic certainty, it drives very specific cognitive biases. The first one being confirmation bias.
Because once the spam filter flags him as a threat, it just stops looking for reasons he might be innocent.
Exactly right. The officers focus entirely on the physical act of him forwarding the information. They selectively ignore the lack of actual societal harm. They ignore his academic track record. They ignore his actual intent.
They just need to close the file.
The label of guilty has already been applied, so they only seek out evidence that reinforces that label to quickly close the loop.
Which leads to a massive question for me. I can understand a system operating like a machine, sure, but there are actual living human beings sitting across the table from Dr. Chen.
Yes, there are.
How do individual detectives or prosecutors sit with a guy who is clearly just a nerdy academic, hear him talk about physics, and still justify treating him like a malicious criminal? Like, how does basic human empathy not override the bureaucracy there?
The text provides a really fascinating answer to that, actually. It points to the fundamental attribution error.
Okay, remind me what that is.
It's a cognitive bias where we attribute other people's actions to their internal immutable character rather than looking at external situational factors.
Oh, right. Like if someone cuts you off in traffic.
Exactly. The fundamental attribution error makes you assume they are just a selfish, terrible person rather than considering, hey, maybe they're rushing a sick child to the hospital.
Right, so we judge ourselves by our circumstances, but we judge others by their character.
Exactly. So the judicial officers observed Chen forwarding a post. Instead of looking at the situational context that this is a researcher engaging in academic exploration, maybe gathering data on social media trends, they attributed his action to a malicious, intentional desire to provoke trouble.
They judged his core character based on a single heuristic metric.
Yes.
But even then, I mean, if the evidence is thin, How do the individuals sleep at night knowing what they're doing?
That's where the sources bring in Albert Bandura's theory of moral disengagement.
Moral disengagement.
Yeah. This is the psychological mechanism that actually allows individuals to participate in an oppressive system without experiencing crippling cognitive dissonance.
Oh, wow. How does it work?
They diffuse responsibility. The individuals in the system tell themselves things like, I don't make the laws, I just enforce them, or I'm just a cog in the machine.
Right, the classic excuse.
And they rationalize the punishment by adopting the institutional narrative that they are protecting, quote, social stability. By displacing the responsibility onto the abstract system itself, they mentally wash their hands of the personal moral weight of destroying a man's life.
So the system actually provides the psychological cover for the individual to ignore their own empathy.
Yes, it does.
That is incredibly dark, but it explains so much about how bureaucracies actually function.
It really does.
So we've established these two completely opposed psychological entities now. We have Dr. Chen, whose mind is crystallizing under pressure into this fortress of post-formal complexity.
Right.
And we have the institutional system, which is actively degrading its own analytical capabilities to rely on hyper-simplified binary threat heuristics.
Exactly.
Let's look at what actually happens when these two forces meet in the room.
The sources describe the result as a profound cognitive mismatch.
It's not just a misunderstanding then.
No, it goes way beyond a simple misunderstanding. It is a complete structural failure of communication. They are operating in entirely different perceptual realities.
Yeah, the documentation points out a specific, really tragic moment that highlights this mismatch perfectly.
Yes, the interrogation moment.
Right. During the interrogation, Dr. Chen, utilizing his scientific background, states to them, quote, "I am a skeptic. I doubt all knowledge."
And see, in his mind, he is demonstrating epistemic humility.
Right.
He is saying that as a scholar, he doesn't claim to know the absolute truth of any information on the internet. He questions everything. I mean, it's the foundation of the scientific method.
But the judicial system, which is operating on those binary heuristics we just broke down, they literally cannot process intellectual humility.
Not at all.
Because the spam filter only looks for keywords. So when they hear, "I doubt all knowledge," their risk-averse framework translates that into a literal confession.
They infer intent. What they hear is, he knew the information was false and he spread it anyway. In legal terms, they are trying to establish mens rea, a guilty mind. The system assumes that a highly educated man must have known the absolute truth value of the information. They just cannot fathom a worldview where truth is complex and subjective.
It is just a horrific mistranslation. He offers them the scientific method, and they literally write it down as a confession of malicious intent.
Exactly. Because the system demands what the sources call obedient expression.
Obedient expression.
Yes, they want him to submit to authority, check the box, admit fault, and just say the simple binary thing that clears their desk.
But Dr. Chen cannot provide that obedient expression.
No.
Because of his high self-congruence and that mature personality integration we discussed earlier, he can only offer authentic expression.
Right. He has to stay true to his internal values and his complex view of the world. To submit to their simplified narrative would be to basically destroy his own psychological integrity.
And the text notes, this wasn't a debate over the physical facts of what he did on social media. I mean, everyone agreed he clicked forward.
Yes, the action wasn't in dispute.
The clash was entirely about interpretive frames. The system was using a strict risk framework. They viewed Chen as an anomaly, a threat that needed to be managed and neutralized to restore order.
But Chen was operating entirely within a knowledge framework. He saw himself as a scholar engaging in theoretical exploration of social phenomena.
Right.
And the text suggests that because the system lacks the cognitive flexibility to understand a post-formal thinker like Chen, it just resorts to the only tool it has for dealing with the unknown: power and punishment. The system didn't actually judge him based on harm. It categorized him just to soothe its own institutional anxiety.
Which leads me to a really difficult question.
Okay.
If both sides were operating exactly as their underlying psychology dictates, if Chen's brain is hardwired by his education to seek truth through complexity, and the system is hardwired by its bureaucracy to seek safety through extreme simplification, is justice even possible without some kind of psychological translator in the room?
Well, the analysis synthesizes a rather bleak conclusion regarding that. True psychological justice was entirely absent here.
Man.
Yeah. The system projected its own fear of ambiguity onto a marginalized, complex thinker. because justice requires the capacity to comprehend the intent and context of the individual.
Right.
And this system, by its very psychological design, had stripped that capacity away just to increase its processing speed.
That is such a heavy realization. And while we are talking about a very specific, extreme legal case from these documents, the mechanics of what we just discussed, the heuristics, the cognitive mismatch, the moral disengagement, I mean, they happen in our own lives every single day.
Oh, absolutely. The psychological principles at play here are completely universal.
Right. Think about your own life. We all face moments where we judge someone based on our own stressed out, simplified heuristics.
All the time.
How often do we commit the fundamental attribution error? You assume the person moving slowly in the grocery store aisle or, I don't know, the colleague who sends a blunt email. It's just fundamentally a bad or incompetent person.
Right, because it's easy.
Exactly. We entirely ignore the incredibly complex, messy reality of whatever they might be going through just because slapping a label on them is easier for our tired brains to process. We act like the institutional system. We use a spam filter on other human beings.
It really is a vital exercise in self-awareness. When we feel that urgent need to simplify a situation and judge someone quickly, we need to pause and ask if we are sacrificing the truth of another person's complexity just to soothe our own cognitive anxiety.
So check your internal smoke detectors. Are you really seeing a fire, or are you just reacting to a little bit of burnt toast because you're stressed out?
That's a great way to put it.
And that leaves us with a final provocative thought to mull over today. Based on everything we've read in this documentation, if human institutions, whether it's a legal system, a corporation, or a government, if they are psychologically hardwired to fear ambiguity, and if they are structurally designed to simplify messy human behavior into rigid binary checkboxes, how can any legal system ever accurately judge the true complexity of the human mind?
It really forces us to question the very foundation of how we design authority, doesn't it?
It really makes you wonder. Maybe true justice doesn't just require better laws or better judges. Maybe true justice requires a fundamental psychological evolution in how we actually build institutions.
Absolutely.
We started today talking about a mind under extreme pressure in an interrogation room. The system expected him to implode, to beg, to simplify himself.
But Dr. Chen didn't.
No, he crystallized. He built a fortress of thought that the system couldn't crush, even if they couldn't understand it. And maybe, just maybe, the systems that judge us need to evolve to withstand a little more pressure so they don't crush the human complexity they were originally built to protect. Keep questioning, keep learning, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.